Hello, everybody, and welcome. If this is your first time tuning in, my name is Joel. I'm the lead pastor of Encounter, and we're really glad that you're joining us today. We're in the last week of a series that we're calling Into the Unknown. And the gist of this series is that, as we enter this new year, we're a month into 2021. If this year is anything like last year, and I really hope it's not, it's going to be a year that's full of unknowns, full of things that we can't predict, and definitely things that we cannot control. And how do we face life like that? How do we face life that we have no control over, that we cannot fully plan for, right? And one of the things we're looking at is that the way in which we do that is that we listen to the guidance of God, that we submit our need for control, we submit our need to have our plans turn out the way we want them, and we listen to God and to where God is leading us. And last week we looked a little bit about the different ways in which God speaks to us and how that helps us, move along and make decisions. And towards the end of that sermon, I took some minutes to touch into an idea that I've noticed a lot in people that I talk to that want God's guidance. And it's that underneath the desire of wanting to know what God wants, there's this anxiety or this fear of, well, what if I make the wrong decision, right? Like I have this job opportunity, and what if I take it, and what if for whatever reason it doesn't work out? Or I'm about to marry this person, and what if I marry this person and it's the wrong person to marry, and the marriage doesn't work out, and I find myself with my heart broken and suffering a few years down the road. And we want to come together, and we want to God to help us make those decisions so we don't end up making the wrong decision. We don't end up making the decision that's going to cause pain or suffering. And I appreciate that, and I can understand. Like, I feel like that a lot. Like, what if I make a decision and it ends up not working out the right way? But one of the things I've learned in the last few years, kind of like following God and studying the scriptures, is that there's a flaw with that understanding of decision making. And it's not that there are no such thing as wrong decisions, but I think that underneath that, what we have in mind is that it's not only that they're wrong decision, but that there is this perfect ideal decision, right? That there's perfect ideal world. And if I just figure out how to make the right decisions over and over, I'm going to kind of like maximize my pleasure and minimize my pain. Make the most money and marry the most attractive and compatible person and suffer the less. And we're kind of like trying to find that sweet spot of how to get there. And honestly, part of that has been fueled by bad theology. Like if you grew up in church, you've maybe heard, the phrase, God loves you and he has a perfect plan for your life, right? And like, that's one of the things that we use to like bring people into church. You should become a Christian, because if you become a Christian, you are going to, jump into God's perfect plan for your life that will maximize your pleasure and minimize your pain. Part of how we got that is that, we take some scriptures out of context. There's this passage in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 29, verse 11, that's very, very famous, right? It says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and the future." And we take passages like, we take other passages that we read in the scriptures, and we kind of like sell people this idea that, if we were just to make the right decisions, if we always were able to get God to tell us what to do and we listen and obeyed, life would be as good as it could get. That there's this perfect path out there for us somehow. And what I want to kind of like speak into today is that I'm not sure that that's actually how it works. And that we may have this myth of this ideal life that's perfect, and if we just make the right decisions, we're going to get there. Because that life doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist for a couple of reasons. Number one is that one of the things that you see from the scriptures is that we live in a world that's not ideal. Like, we live in a world that's not perfect. It's not that it was designed to be like that. Like the scripture says that God wanted this world, God created this world to be good and for us to enjoy it and feel it and fulfill it. And at the same time, we also see that sin had entered into that story. And because sin entered into the story, the world is no longer perfect. Like the shalom, the perfect harmony with which God designed the world, is no longer there. It has been broken. So we live in a world where there is suffering, where there is pain, where there are natural disasters, where global pandemics occur. And in a world like that, well, whatever ideal vision we have for life, it's never going to quite get there because the circumstances in the world aren't there. And the other reason why, the ideal world isn't there is because a lot of times we think that the only thing that influences our future is our decisions. Why is that? If I make the right decision, then I'm going to, move up on my career and be fulfilled and have a good relationship and be happy. But one of the things that really you've learned in life early on, and we've definitely seen in the last year, is that our lives are way more interconnected than that, right? That we can make the decision to, join this company and be the best workers that we can be, and maybe our bosses are not so good. Or maybe there's some corruption in our company, or it's mismanaged and it goes under. It has nothing to do with us, but other people's decisions affect our lives. It happens in relationships. We can love a person as much as we can with our hearts, and we can believe that this person loves us back, and then one day they say, hey, this is not working out for me anymore. You see what I'm saying? Like we live in a world where our wills are not enough to make the future look the way we want it to look. And I'm telling you these two things because what you have to understand is, how do we function in a world like that so much so little is out of our control? What does an ideal future look like? Like that ideal future, a lot of times, it doesn't exist. And when we think, and a lot of times we understand that, at an intellectual level, but what we do then, when we think of God, what we want God to do when we ask God for guidance, we want God to kind of like steer us away from the bad choice. We want God to steer us away from, hey, if you take this job or if you take this career, the company is going to go under in a year and you're going to be unemployed. So don't take this job, right? If you marry this person, that person is not going to like you like 2 years from now and you're going to get your heart broken. So don't marry that person, right? Like we want God to steer us away from the wrong choice. The problem with that is that we're making the assumption that then the other choice is going to work out perfect. That we don't do that, then what's the alternative? And a lot of times we think almost like life is like a game show, right? Like there's door number one, and in door number one, there is, the bad choice. And there might be pain and suffering in that door. But door number two is great. And if we stay away from door number one, we're going to go into door number two, and door number two is going to be full of happiness. And when we live in a fallen world, and we live in a world where not only our actions influence our lives, but the actions of other people influence our lives, there is no ideal door. Life doesn't work like that. That door number one has suffering and pain, but door number two might not be perfect either. There might be different type of adversity in door number one. There is no such thing as the ideal option. Now, that can sound very pessimistic, like life is going to be terrible. I'm not saying that because I do think that there's such a thing as wise decisions and unwise decisions. There's such thing also as virtuous decisions and sinful decisions. And each of those decisions carry with it its own consequences and its own circumstances, and the decisions that we make and how we make them, well, they affect our lives and they affect how we live our lives. But what I want you to see is that because you don't live your life in a vacuum where it's only your decisions, the ones that will determine your future, this idea of the perfect decision, of the perfect world, it doesn't exist on this side of eternity. And when you understand that, there's a freedom that comes with that because we're not living with the anxiety of what if I'm missing out on my best life, right? What if there's this life out there for me where I'm the perfect version of myself and I'm making the most money and I'm looking the best I can and I'm living in the best neighborhood and I feel like I made the wrong decision sometime along the road and I'm not there. And maybe I married the wrong person. If I had married the other person that I was talking to at the time, maybe I would be there, right? And we live lives filled with regrets and filled with this what if. What if I missed out on the best possible life for me? And what I tell you there is that that's not how life works. That's not what we see in the scriptures. Now, what do we see in the scriptures? Because that passage is there, right? Jeremiah 29:11, that God tells the people of Israel, I have a plan for you. And it's a plan to give you hope and to give you a good future. And I think that that's only true for God and the people of Israel. That's true for all of us who are the people of God. The Apostle Paul, in the book of Romans, we looked at this passage last week. He says, and we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. So there is no such thing as like the ideal decision where everything is perfect, because we live in a fallen world. And at the same time, the scriptures repeatedly say that God has good plans for his people and good purposes for his people. And how do the two match up, right? And a lot of times we want to get there. Like we want to, hey, if I just make the right decision, then I'm going to have access to that good plan. I'm going to have access to that good future. And that's true. Like there are decisions that will bring you more pain than other decisions. But no decision will be perfect because you don't live in a perfect world. And what we see in the scriptures is actually the opposite of that. What we see in the scriptures is that even though we live in a fallen world, and even though we live in a world where all sorts of different players and agents have, their own decisions to make and decisions that affect people, in the midst of that, since the very beginning, God has been working to bring history and to bring the lives of his people towards a good destiny and towards a good future. You see, God's sovereignty doesn't work either in the deterministic end where God controls every single aspect of everybody's life. And, we end up in that way of thinking, making God responsible for all sorts of horrible things, for natural disasters and for famines and things that we see in the scriptures that God hates, things that we see in the scriptures that God sent his son so that they wouldn't happen anymore. But on the other end, it's not like God is kind of like completely aloof and detached and doesn't kind of like care of what happens in your life. What we see is a God who works within our decisions and within how the world turns out, and still ends up kind of like bringing it towards a good end and towards a good conclusion and towards a good future. You see that throughout the scriptures, right? God puts Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and they were meant to live idyllic, perfect lives, and they disobey God. And because they disobey God, that goes out the window. And yet God remains committed to them and promises that one day, the fruit of the womb of Eve, talking in the future about Jesus, would crush the serpent's head, would bring finally wholeness again into the world. And then we see that in the story of Noah, humanity kind of like going completely off the rails. And God, not just completely fully giving up on humanity, but preserving Noah and his family so that a new life could work out. And then even then, humanity again going off the rails, and God calling Abraham out of that to bring then the nation of Israel into play. And then the nation of Israel going completely off the rails, and God out of that bringing Jesus. And then the church to finally bring his purposes of redemption into the world. You see what I'm saying? Like if it's almost like we're playing this game of chess with God. And God makes a move, and it's a good move, and it's a move that offers you hope and future, and we take it, and sometimes we make the wrong decision. And even though we make that wrong decision, God kind of like takes that and makes a different move to continue being committed to our redemption. God has never given up in redeeming the world. And I think that at the same time that's true kind of like in the larger macro perspective of the world, that's also true in our individual lives. That I don't think really that there is this perfect ideal plan where everything happens the wrong way. There's the decisions that we make and the decisions that other people make. But within that, when we listen to God's guidance, God's committed to bring our lives to a good future. To a place of healing and wholeness where we get to experience his love the most, and when we get to understand, the love of Jesus, and we get to be witnesses of the love of Jesus to others. And throughout our lives, God's kind of like guiding us there. And sometimes we follow the wrong door, so to speak, and we end up in a place that we shouldn't have ended. Maybe it's because no fault of our own, but because of other people's decisions. Sometimes it's because of our decisions. Sometimes, we knew that it was wrong decision and we made it because we wanted to make it. And then we find ourselves in a place of brokenness or suffering. And a lot of times what happens is that when we find ourselves in places like that, we feel like our lives are over. We feel like we missed out. We feel like now we're like on plan B, and plan B is never going to be like plan A, right? Like plan A would have been like the Tesla and the mansion, right? And now we have to get like a condo and a bicycle. And it's not going to be the way we want it to be. And we live kind of like a little bit like depressed and sad because of that, because we feel like our life could have been so much better. And what I want to tell you is that that's not how the scriptures work, and that's not how God works. Because what we see in the scriptures is that whatever decision we make, whether good or bad, God can work within that decision, within those circumstances, to bring something good and something beautiful out of that. That's what Paul is saying in that chapter of Romans, that in all things, in all circumstances, God works for the good of those who love Him. What I'm trying to tell you is that both door number 1 and door number 2 are not perfect or ideal. Door number 1 might be less suffering of a certain sort than door number 2, but door number 2 isn't perfect either. And that no matter what door you take, whatever circumstances you find yourself after taking that step, there, God's still at work. And God can still bring something beautiful out of your life. You know that passage that we read at the beginning in Jeremiah 29:11, right? God saying, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to give you hope and a future." Think about how Israel gets to that place. God has rescued the people of Israel from being slaves in Egypt, and they've wandered in the desert for 40 years, which they weren't meant to do. They should have gotten to the promised land in months, but they rebel against God. They don't trust that God can help them take the promised land. So they're wandering for 40 years until the next generation takes the promised land. And then they go into the promised land, and they go into a period called the period of the judges, that's characterized by a lot of chaos and a lot of suffering because people wander away from God. And then they go into the period of the kings, and they have good kings and they have bad kings. Eventually, the nation of Israel as a whole is divided into two because of the sin of one of those kings. And then you see like a list of kings that do good things and terrible things, and there's periods of peace and there's periods of war. And throughout all that, God sending prophet after prophet to the people of Israel, telling you need to repent, you need to change your ways, because if you don't, this is going to end up in destruction. And they never listen to God until eventually the empire of Babylon comes and destroys really the nation of Judah and takes them into exile. After the other side of the kingdom, the nation of Israel has been destroyed by the Assyrian Empire. Throughout all that, you see over and over, God telling the people of Israel, don't make this decision. This is the wrong decision. You should not make this decision. Things are not going to go well. And over, they kind of like just keep making their decision going their own way. And there, in exile, after failure, after failure, after failure, after failure to make the right decision, God speaks to them and He says, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to bring you hope and a future." That's not plan A, it's not plan B, it's not plan C, it's like plan Z. And God, because of His love for His people, remains committed to them. And remains committed to bringing their lives to a good future. And I'm telling you this because maybe you are right now in a place where you feel like you've made the wrong decision. Maybe you feel like you married the wrong person. Maybe you feel like you took the wrong job. Maybe you're looking back into the past of your life and you're thinking, hey, my friends are getting ahead so much faster than me. And where did I go wrong? Or maybe you're facing your future and you're full of anxiety. What if I make the wrong decision? And that can be paralyzing. And I'm not telling you again that there are not decisions that are inherently unwise or inherently sinful that will bring pain and suffering. But what I'm telling you is that even if you've made the wrong decision, that doesn't necessarily mean that your life is over. And also that just because you're facing adversity and suffering and things aren't the way you thought they would be, that doesn't mean that you made the wrong decision, because life isn't perfect and ideal and there is adversity and suffering in each scenario. And yet, what the scriptures tell us is that in wherever we are, however we got to where we are, however we get to wherever you get after the next decision that you make, in there, in that place, in the midst of success or in the midst of failure, in the midst of joy or in the midst of suffering, in the midst of a period of, peace and enjoyment, or in the midst of a period of chaos and anxiety, wherever you are, that God still has plans. And that God still has a future, that in all things, God works together for the good of those who love Him. And when we realize this, when we understand this, when we believe this, the anxiety that we feel of what if I make the wrong decision, what if I made the wrong decision, it goes out the window. And there is a peace, and honestly, like a clarity of mind, a faith that comes, that allows us to take the next step. Because we're trusting that no matter what happens, God is not going to just abandon us. God is not going to just reject us. God is not going to just drop us. But wherever we find ourselves, and it might not be any place, and it might not be the place that God wanted for you to, right? Like God might have wanted a much less complicated life. And yet this is where you are, and there, God is committed to doing something with you. I'm a big fan of J.R.R. Tolkien. That's the guy that wrote The Rings. And one of the books that he has called the Silmarillion, it's going to sound nerdy for a minute. That's kind of like the creation myth of Middle Earth, right? And in that world, like the God character, the way that the world is created is that the God character kind of like brings all his angels together and sings them a song. And the song that he sings them is basically, as God is singing this song, the world is coming into being, right? Like and like mountains are springing up and the rivers are coming, kind of like what we see in Genesis, that God speaks and the world comes to existence. And as he's singing this song, one of the characters that's kind of like representing Satan, he kind of like wants some of that. So he starts kind of like singing against the song that God is singing. And he's trying to sing his own song, and obviously because it's a bad guy, it's Satan, so his song kind of like takes like dark notes and it goes in a different direction. And there's this scene that's incredibly beautiful, because every time that the Satan character tries to like go off key and sing his own tune that's like dark and destructive, the God character sings over Satan, wherever that key is, wherever that is, and out of that brings a note and a melody that's even more beautiful than what it was before. That in spite of the best efforts of evil to derail history, that in spite of our best efforts to derail our lives, that God hasn't given up. And that out of that, God can bring something more beautiful. There's a little quote that I want to read you, kind of like from that book, the Silmarillion. It says, "Then Iluvatar," meaning God, spoke, and he said, "Mighty are the Ainur," it's kind of like the angels, "and mightiest among them is Melkor," that's the Satan character. "But that he may know, and all the Ainur, that I am Iluvatar, those things that you have sung, I will show them forth." He's saying like that, those dark melodies that they're bringing, they're going to happen. He says, "that you may see what you have done." And then it says, "And thou, Melkor, shalt see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." God's saying, give your best shot at derailing your life, and I can still bring something good out of that. God's like a jazz musician. Like jazz is like a lot of like improvising, right? Like we all play, a musician plays, their own tune and scales, and then another musician kind of like riffs on that, and they keep going. And a lot of times, we make our own decisions. We play our own melody, and sometimes it might not be the right melody. And yet God, out of that, he can improvise and bring a better melody and a more beautiful story. And what I want to leave you with tonight is this, like, let go of the anxiety and let go of the fear. that you can destroy and ruin your life beyond repair by making the wrong decision. Because wherever you find yourself, God can bring a good melody out of that. Whatever your life is at, your story isn't over. And God can redeem that, and God can restore it. Trust in God's love for you. And let the peace of God come into you. And let that peace then move you in faith into making whatever decision you have to make for the future. Listening to God. Trusting that wherever you go, God goes with you. Grace